Now we turn to Dr. David Perry, President of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and host of the weekly Defense Deconstructed podcast. Dave, thanks for accepting the CDA Institute's invitation to partake in the expert series. Great having you on. We have quite a bit of ground to cover, so maybe we can start with a scene setter. How has SSE impacted defense procurement in Canada, and what lessons have been learned from its implementation?
So I think it impacted procurement significantly in a couple senses. I took a procurement system that was already pretty supercharged with the amount of money and the amount of demand in terms of projects, big projects, the amount of money that had been already in the system as a legacy of the previous Harper government's attempts to recapitalize, reinvest in the military, which were building on the Martin government's attempts to recapitalize, reinvest, all of which were following on about a decade and a half of really low underinvestment in capital equipment purchases in particular. And then Strong Secure Engaged came in pledging to add tens of billions of dollars more capital investment. And to do that with a very quick ramp up period. Lots of folks had focused on the length of the tail and how back end loaded the policy was, but I actually was struck by how aggressive it was and its planned increased spending in the early years, which I think has basically proven to have been far too ambitious from the beginning. I think the biggest takeaway should be that we do not, at our peril, spend nearly enough time focused on implementation, and that it's one thing to go secure authorities, secure the policy approval, get money, actually moving it and implementing it, spending the money, getting to contract, moving paper through all the different parts of the procurement system is hugely problematic. Whatever you think about our system, I think it at a minimum is not calibrated adequately with the demand we're putting on it. So we've got more ambition than we can execute in the time frame. And there wasn't, I don't think, enough recognition of that at the outset about what would actually need to be done to implement it. There were a number of initiatives that, in Strong Secure Engaged around procurement streamlining. Those are all good things. I noted at the time that a lot of them were at least 5 years old at that point and hadn't actually been implemented. And the pace of implementation of some of those, some of which I'm not actually sure whether or not they're ever finished or not. And nobody seems to want to talk about them anymore, which would kind of suggest that they didn't really go anywhere. But they were all relatively incremental. And you were talking about having a pretty significant increase, like 3-4-fold increase in terms of the amount of money spent within just a couple of years, which is a pretty significant change. So I think the lesson from that is that you got to be realistic about implementation, need to be realistic about timeframes, and actually trying to baseline expectations for what you're going to do moving forward with a reasonable understanding of what is possible with this system that you've got at the moment, if you're not planning for consequential change quickly. And we tend to have a habit of going for incremental change slowly. And if you're going to do that, then you can't expect the output to rise dramatically.
What were the key elements and considerations that shaped Canada's strong, secure, engaged national defense policy, and what was the policy-making process behind it? Furthermore, what are some of the fundamental developments that have occurred since the inception of SSE?
So I think some of the kind of the context, the Liberal Party had pledged to do a defense policy review in its campaign platform, which had included almost everything under the sun, including a couple of kitchen sinks. There was hundreds of campaign commitments in there, but on defense, they were pretty, I think, oriented around that. So there was some, I think, at least enthusiasm at the political level for doing that, and a pretty strong commitment to do a review, make it public, do a lot of consultation, all of which happened. It also then ended up in practical terms occurring against the backdrop of the NAFTA negotiations, which I think put a lot finer point on what came through that, because it happened against the backdrop of a Trump administration being much more focused on being transactional and calling us out much more explicitly about where we stood in terms of what we were spending on defense. And I think it's probably no coincidence that the campaign commitment to do a review, but to keep basically the spending trajectory constant with the predecessor Harper government evolved to a multi-tens of billions of dollar increase. There was no accident that happened against the backdrop of the NAFTA negotiations. And I think we've seen in Canada successive policy documents and reviews have basically not made enormous changes in terms of, broadly speaking, what we're looking to do in terms of actually delivering policy outcomes. Same broad mission set, roles to the forces. You see a bunch of tinkering around kind of the specific force structure, but really not a ton of evolution in my observation. But really, it's a question about how large a check governments are willing to write, and then what that allows to get done. So whether or not you're going to do a scaled down replacement of fleets, like in the Navy's case as an example, or whether or not there's the money being provided to do a larger, more fulsome one. On fighter jets, we went from we ended up through a whole bunch of trials and tribulations, basically committing to an expanded fleet of our tactical fighters when we actually get around to getting them. So I think there was an increased level of ambition in some cases. It was also happening against a backdrop of, at least in the early years of the Trudeau government, a lot of enthusiasm about deliverology and ostensibly focusing on implementation, which seemed to basically dematerialize after a couple of years. So there's a bit of an irony there. I think one of the other big focuses at the time, which didn't, I think, hold up all that well over time for a couple of reasons, but a lot of focus about trying to be more rigorous about costing and funding. I think it was probably the best costed and most calibrated funding decision. I don't think that necessarily means fully funded or best funded, but there was a stronger effort to be more rigorous about some of the costing elements that went into the policy document and try and be more deliberate, I think, and more precise about linking money with specific outcomes and being more conscious and rigorous about doing that. At the end of the day, though, that all got vastly overstated, and I think it had been clung to for far too long, and some people still do, to say that that policy was fully funded and fully costed. It may have been fully costed, but a lot of, certainly on the procurement side, a whole bunch of those projects were basically an identification or early options analysis, which meant that it was way too early to have any realistic expectation of having a lot of fidelity on what those things were going to cost. And there also hadn't been very rigorous work done about implementation, which meant that you couldn't calibrate accurately or plan with a much degree of certainty about when you would actually be moving them forward. And all that meant that the project budgets got out of sync just in terms of a time phasing. And that left a number of different issues in terms of the affordability of different project budgets, even prior to the last, call it 18 months, where we've seen inflation in the consumer economy go bananas, supply chains get totally disrupted, and then the largest land war on the planet at a conventional scale in Ukraine totally turned a whole chunk of the international defense industrial base market upside down. And I think that all of that has really undermine most of the finance into the whatever the next update to that policy is. Somebody's going to have to deal with a whole bunch of legacy holdover affordability issues and deal with the mismatch between ambition and underpinning financial support.
What are your thoughts, concerns, and predictions regarding the upcoming defense policy update?
So if you look at what the Liberal Party in power since 2015 has done so far, both with Strong Secure Engaged and then the NORAD modernization announcement, as well as some other pieces in the budget in 2022, and some maneuvers it made to kind of accounting room to allow for additional investment kind of within the existing financial framework through some of their fall updates. I would predict that if there is a review that comes to fruition, I'm not 100% convinced that there will be one, because if it didn't come out for the NATO summit, then I'm not 100% convinced what the driver is going to be to get it released. But if there is one, I would predict that it's going to provide what is ostensibly a huge amount of money, but an amount that would fall very well short of the aspirations and expectations for the Department of National Defense, who will probably have its hopes and dreams crushed. And to expand on that, I mean, I'd also say that I don't yet remain convinced that enough time is going to have gone into focusing on its implementation. I think that still remains a big weakness of our system. We're a lot more oriented around securing approval for new things and not enough oriented around focusing on delivering what we have in the here and now. I think the other thing, just to kind of build off what I was saying before about having to deal with those, financial pressures, I don't yet think that the government of Canada writ large, nor the Department of National Defense, has come to grips with the current inflationary environment that we live in now. We have a whole accounting regime set up around procurement that allows money to be reprofiled into the future. It sort of addressed an explicit use it or lose it dynamic that we used to have historically, which incidentally also provided more of a forcing function, I think, because you had to use it or you lost it. But now the current accrual accounting system, the capital investment fund framework that we have allows money to be reprofiled from one year to the next without ostensibly a huge amount of trouble. Up until a year and a half ago, all kinds of that had happened, but all of it had happened under an environment of historically rock bottom interest rates and cost of financing, which are now, those have now returned to kind of more historically normal rates. And so the impact of lost purchasing power now is dramatically different than it had been up until early part of 2022. And I don't think we've really come to grips with that. So the previous flexibility slash option of reprofiling money indefinitely is going to be a lot more consequential now that the Bank of Canada's rate's gone to 5% for the first time in a generation. And I don't know that we've come to grips with the impact of not being able to move and spend money on schedule yet.
Considering the changes in the geopolitical environment over the past 5 years, what specific areas should the update of the defense policy focus on to ensure its relevance and effectiveness? And what recommendations might you have?
I think one of the takeaways for me from the war in Ukraine is that we need to have more of a focus on what we can do in the next, say, 5 years. It's great to have aspirations and it's necessary to plan out over a longer time horizon. But I think in some cases, we have a tendency in Canada to do that at the expense of actually implementing what's actually real in the near term. And by real, I mean, we don't spend enough time focusing on actually spending money that has already been policy approved, for which people have already got money in the bank and secured authorities to spend, and we don't spend enough time on actually executing that, because that's really the meaningful route to getting capability in hand within a 5-year period. Any project that is introduced new in the defense policy update, if it comes to fruition, I wouldn't expect to turn into fieldable operational military capability inside 15 years if we're lucky, other than by a few exceptions. And more realistically, be looking at a 20-year into the future time horizon for actually getting operational capability. That's been our track record for big systems, and that's without factoring in all the personnel limitations in the Canadian military right now, shortages of people across the board, including incidentally in most of the parts of the organization that need to be engaged to actually do procurement, to move forward on the military side, the force development aspects, all that kind of stuff. So I think we've also seen that there are other countries, peer competitors, adversaries, whatever you want to call them, that have had taken different approaches to their ability to be ready for conflict right now. It's been interesting watching over the last 500 days, people mocking the amount, the age and state of the equipment the Russians are pulling out of deep storage, but they've pulled out sequentially 40 or 50-year-old tanks that exist in numbers that are 4 or 5 times larger than most NATO countries have in their entire holdings, and they're obviously they're not as modern and not as capable, but there's I think a definite quality to having quantity which we lack entirely, that has been exposed here. So getting our heads around the idea of it's important to actually have a bunch of capability today and more depth to it. We've also shown, not just in Canada, but especially in Canada, that we really have very little depth in a lot of different ways. We've now we had this whole discussion about how many tanks we're able to send to Ukraine, and one of the fundamental limits on that was we only had 80 to start with. And if you have 80 instead of a couple of hundred or more than that, then your ability to deploy any of them is obviously going to be a lot less. And we don't have much in the way of holdings of ammunition for war stocks. I don't think our spare parts inventories are very deep. So our ability to actually engage and sustain in conflict is pretty limited. And I think that made a lot of sense during past eras of conflict that we're looking at: asymmetric fighting, counterinsurgency, peacekeeping. You didn't need to have much in the way of artillery ammunition on reserve. I think we should have learned in the last 500 days that you need to have a lot more of that on hand, and also have a much, much better ability to actually mobilize for a larger scale conflict. So strong, secure, engaged spent a lot of time talking about, return to great power competition, which I think in essence means return to having to think about conventional conflict in a peer on peer or near peer, or whatever you want to call it, kind of dynamic. And that looks more like Ukraine, where you've got a combination of all the kind of fancy new toys, better connectivity, digitization, drones, all that kind of stuff, with World War One scale levels of artillery usage. And even if we think that we're, going to be needing maybe half or a quarter or a third or whatever the right number is, the volume of those kinds of fires, because we use more precision rather than mass, uh, I think we are still dramatically underinvesting in the kind of depth you need to do that. And I also think, unfortunately, in the last 500 days, we've shown that we seem to have totally lost the muscle memory on how to actually go and engage and mobilize the defense industrial base to support that. Still haven't seen any effort in this country to ramp up and engage the defense industry to either support Ukraine on a systemic basis. We've provided a lot of money to buy things kind of on 6-month cycles, but no effort to engage in any kind of longer term ramp up to support Ukraine in the short term or the medium term, because I think it's increasingly clear that this conflict's not going to be wrapped up by the end of the calendar year. So they're going to need support to keep going. And I would point to the cluster munitions decision, which I don't think the U.S. government was tremendously thrilled about making, but we've demonstrated collectively that we don't have the capacity to keep supplying that level and type of conflict for as long as proven necessary. And at least in Canada, we haven't actually moved to engage that, to spool up some of our own domestic manufacturing. We've seen that in the US. The European Union has actually come forward with some plans to do that. There's some mention about that at the most recent NATO summit, but still waiting to see some of that here. And certainly, after multiple decades of calibrating our force structure, our equipment holdings, all the kind of strategic sustainment behind that against low intensity conflict, there's a big effort to reorient around a much higher level of intensity of fighting, at least potentially, and be prepared for that in a way that I think we've demonstrated we clearly have not been. And I don't know that we've really meaningfully moved towards it.
To your knowledge, what specific measures is the government implementing to streamline the defense procurement process?
I think we could burn through whatever amount of time you have notionally remaining with me answering that. I think fundamentally we've got the system that we've collectively decided is what we want, because there's been no concrete effort to make meaningful change to change it in any kind of meaningfully consequential way. There's been all kinds of different efforts at streamlining and improvement over the years, but I think most of that has been pretty incremental tinkering on the margins. Hasn't been anything that's been meaningfully transformative. The basic contours and outlines of the system have largely stayed the same. It's been incrementally added to in terms of lots of different parts of process, oversight mechanisms to address past problems, real or perceived. Difference between the two not really mattering all that much. If the people in charge perceive a problem, then whether or not there is one, I think in a lot of ways has been immaterial, because they've driven change to reflect what they think is an issue that needs to be mitigated. And we've under-resourced it. I'd point to the example of the passport office that lots of Canadians would be familiar with the last year and a bit. We had a massive issue about working through a backlog of passport applications that was affecting people in a tangible way, and the timelines have become insane. And there were over 1,500, I think, additional staff put against that problem. And when I looked at the data, there was basically like roughly speaking, like a twofold increase in demand over historical expectation for passport usage, and the staffing was increased by 1,500 people. Strong, secure, and engage came in. The expectation was that our procurement system was going to spend between 3 and 4 times more money within 4 years. And as best as I can tell, maybe 300 additional people have been added to the material group, which is about an 10-11% increase, something like that. A couple of years ago, Public Services and Procurement Canada had some money to add additional staff. Which, hopefully if you added everybody up together, they could form their own softball team. And so the expectation that without making big systemic changes to do consequential streamlining of that process in a way that removed big chunks of steps. If you're just going to add, a couple of percentage points worth of additional staff and not change anything else, then you shouldn't really be surprised that you can't ramp up and spend 3 to 4 times more money and move that many more big projects that more quickly. And there's been lots of other efforts by the government to try and do other things socioeconomically, that whatever you think about the objectives of those, they are government policy, and it's required to deliver on them through defense and other forms of government procurement, but all of which require capacity and bandwidth and resourcing to execute on. So as we're looking forward, unless the defense update proposes consequential increases in capacity or consequential change in terms of the process in the system to remove steps and have meaningful reductions in time involved in different parts of it, then should expect it to only be able to move incrementally more money, incrementally more projects than before. I think we're kind of at the point where you can keep doing the incremental progressive change, or do some consequential, meaningful rethink, which would have to be some combination of consequential process change and consequential increase in capacity. Otherwise, we're going to keep under delivering the amount of money that's actually been provided, and we're going to take multiple decades instead of 1 or 1.5 to deliver major capabilities.
Dave, thanks once again for joining me. Great to have you on.